On June 20th, 1947, at 10:45 in the evening, a man sat reading the Los Angeles Times on a couch in Beverly Hills. Hollywood remembers him as a movie character, a legend, a punchline. Records show something else. He ran killers, built cities, and moved more money than most banks of his era. This is why the real Jewish Mafia was worse than Goodfellas. Section 1. Meyer Lansky, the mob's accountant. Meyer Suchalansky was 9 years old when he stepped off a ship at the port of New York in 1911. He had traveled from Grodno, a city then part of the Russian Empire and now part of Belarus, with his mother and younger brother Jacob. His father had gone ahead 2 years earlier to find work and a place for the family to live. They settled on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, in a neighborhood packed with other Eastern European Jewish immigrants who had fled the same poverty and violence the Suchalansky family had escaped. The boy who arrived with almost nothing would spend the next several decades helping build and run one of the most profitable criminal operations in American history. One that moved illegal liquor during Prohibition, ran casinos across 3 countries, and worked alongside a hit squad responsible for dozens of murders. He would come to be known by a new name, Meyer Lansky, and federal investigators would spend nearly 50 years trying and mostly failing to put him in prison for any of it. The Lower East Side in the 1910s was crowded and poor. Families lived in small tenement apartments, often with several people sharing one room. Lansky's father worked as a presser in the garment trade, one of the few jobs open to Jewish immigrants without money or connections. Young Meyer sold newspapers and ran errands to help the family get by. It was on these streets, not in a schoolroom, that he learned the 2 skills that would define his life: how to count money carefully and how to survive among people who are often more willing to use violence than words. He met Benjamin Siegel, later known as Bugsy Siegel, as a teenager. By several accounts of their early years, Siegel first approached Lansky trying to extort protection money from him on the street, the same way older, tougher boys extorted small shopkeepers all over the neighborhood. Lansky refused to pay and stood his ground. Instead of beating him, Siegel respected the response, and the two became lifelong friends and business partners. Around the same time, Lansky met Salvatore Lucania, an Italian immigrant a few years older than him, who would later become known as Charlie Lucky Luciano. The two crossed paths when Luciano tried to shake Lansky down for money on his walk home from school. Lansky's defiant response impressed Luciano, just as it had impressed Siegel, and the two formed a partnership that would last the rest of their lives and would eventually reshape organized crime across the entire country. By the 1920s, with Prohibition banning the legal sale of alcohol nationwide, Lansky and Siegel built a bootlegging operation known as the Bug and Meyer Mob, using the two men's nicknames. It ran liquor into New York and quickly earned a reputation as one of the most violent gangs operating during Prohibition. Lansky and Siegel also worked with veteran gambler and racketeer Arnold Rothstein, a man widely credited as one of the first to treat organized crime like a real business, instead of a series of random street fights. Rothstein was shot in November 1928 following a dispute connected to a card game debt, and died, refusing to name his killer. His death left a gap at the top of New York's underworld, one that young men like Lansky, Siegel, and Luciano were ready to fill. In May 1929, Lansky, Luciano, Johnny Torrio, and Frank Costello organized a meeting of major bootlegging and gambling figures in Atlantic City. The idea behind the meeting was simple, but new for the time. Instead of Italian, Jewish, and Irish gangs fighting each other over territory, they could work together, split profits, and run organized crime as a shared business instead of a series of ethnic turf wars. This meeting laid the groundwork for what would later be called the National Crime Syndicate. 2 years later, in 1931, that idea turned violent. Luciano arranged the killings of Joe Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano, the two rival bosses fighting for control of the New York Italian Mafia in a period known as the Castellamarese War. Lansky's close partnership with Luciano through this bloody takeover placed him at the very top of organized crime leadership in the United States, even though he was Jewish and could never formally join the Sicilian Mafia. From this point on, Lansky worked as one of the most trusted financial minds inside a criminal network mostly run by Italian bosses. Within the underworld, he became known as a calm, even-tempered counterweight to some of the more hot-headed men around him. Federal agents and journalists later gave him a nickname that stuck for the rest of his life: the mob's accountant. When Prohibition ended in 1933, the bootlegging money dried up almost overnight. Lansky had seen this coming and began steering the syndicate away from liquor and towards something with less violence attached to it, and in his view, far more long-term potential: gambling. Illegal casinos and betting operations were harder for the government to shut down completely, and because legal gambling was still banned across most of the country, the biggest opportunities sat overseas, out of reach of American law enforcement. Lansky set his sights first on Florida, and then, more ambitiously, on Cuba. He built a relationship with Cuban military strongman Fulgencio Batista starting in the late 1930s, and by the late 1940s, the two men had struck an arrangement that would define the next decade. In exchange for kickbacks, Batista agreed to open Havana to large-scale legal gambling, and to match, dollar for dollar, any hotel investment over $1 million, as long as the project included a casino license. Lansky called on his network to invest, and within a few years he held ownership stakes in at least 3 major Havana properties: the Habana Riviera, the Hotel Nacional, and the Montmartre Club. Cuba became what people in the underworld called an open city, a place where American gangsters could run casinos without the FBI looking over their shoulder. At the same time, Lansky was pushing his oldest friend, Bugsy Siegel, toward a similar opportunity 3,000 miles away, in a small desert town in Nevada called Las Vegas. Nevada had legalized gambling in 1931, and by the mid-1940s, Lansky saw the same long-term potential there that he saw in Havana. He assigned Siegel to oversee construction of a new casino resort called the Flamingo Hotel, and Lansky and his associates put up roughly $1 million to fund it. Siegel proved far better at spending money than managing a construction budget. Costs spiraled. By the time the Flamingo opened on December 26, 1946, Siegel had burned through an estimated $6 million, 6 times the original budget, and the hotel rooms were not even finished. The opening weekend was a financial disaster. The property lost money for weeks. Lansky's partners in the syndicate began to suspect that Siegel, or his girlfriend Virginia Hill, or both of them, had skimmed as much as $1 million of the construction money for themselves. By December 1946, weeks before the troubled Flamingo opening, major organized crime figures gathered in Havana for what became known as the Havana Conference, hosted by Lansky and the recently deported Luciano at the Hotel Nacional. The meeting set policy for the syndicate's business across the country for the years ahead, and according to several biographers who interviewed people close to the events, Siegel's mounting losses were discussed as a serious problem that needed to be resolved. It was around this same period that Lansky was reportedly overheard by an FBI listening device telling his wife, while watching a television news segment about the Mafia, that organized crime in America had grown bigger than U.S. Steel, at the time the largest corporation in the country. On June 20th, 1947, Siegel was shot and killed while sitting on a couch in the Beverly Hills home he had rented for Virginia Hill, reading a copy of the Los Angeles Times. An unidentified gunman fired 9 rounds from an M1 carbine through the living room window from a few feet away. 4 bullets struck Siegel, 2 in the head and 2 in the torso, killing him instantly. Within 20 minutes of his death, associates connected to Lansky and Luciano walked into the Flamingo and announced they were taking over. Lansky never openly admitted approving the killing, and the case remains officially unsolved to this day. But he was later quoted as saying that if the decision had been his alone, Siegel would never have been killed. Regardless of who gave the final order, the timing of the takeover left little doubt in the minds of investigators and journalists that the murder and the change in ownership were connected. With Siegel gone, the Flamingo became profitable within a few years, and it helped establish Las Vegas as the center of legal American gambling for the following decades. Lansky continued to expand his interests across Nevada, Florida, and Cuba throughout the 1950s. He was widely described as the financial organizer who avoided the spotlight, moving money, brokering deals between Italian and Jewish crime figures, and reportedly using a personally owned Swiss bank to launder profits through a network of shell companies. He was also credited, alongside associate Joseph Doc Stacher, with helping pair Jewish and Italian criminal interests into a coordinated national syndicate that operated with far more structure and far less internal warfare than the gang conflicts of the 1920s and early 1930s. Law enforcement circled Lansky for decades without landing a serious conviction. In 1950 and 1951, the Kefauver Committee, a U.S. Senate investigation into organized crime, held televised hearings that exposed the scale and structure of the National Crime Syndicate to the American public for the first time. Lansky's name came up repeatedly as one of its central financial figures. Despite the publicity and years of FBI surveillance that followed, he was indicted numerous times, but convicted only once, in 1953, on a charge of illegal gambling, for which he served 3 months in jail. For nearly 50 years, federal and state authorities built case after case against him, and almost none of it stuck. His fortunes shifted sharply in 1959, when Fidel Castro's revolution overthrew Batista, and the new Cuban government nationalized the hotels and outlawed gambling, wiping out Lansky's casino holdings on the island overnight. With his Cuban income gone, and Miami authorities cracking down on illegal casinos throughout the 1960s, Lansky leaned more heavily on revenue from his Las Vegas investments to stay afloat. In 1970, federal prosecutors indicted Lansky on tax evasion charges connected to the earlier Flamingo skimming allegations. Rather than face trial, Lansky and his second wife Thelma, known as Teddy, flew to Israel that July, settling into hotels and rented apartments near Tel Aviv. In December 1970, they applied for Israeli citizenship under the Law of Return, a statute allowing any Jewish person to settle permanently in Israel. Lansky's application stated that he considered himself Jewish, belonged to a Florida synagogue, and had long supported Israel financially, including money and assistance he had reportedly provided during the country's 1948 War of Independence. Israeli law, however, allowed authorities to deny citizenship to applicants with a serious criminal history if their presence was considered a threat to public welfare. Israel's interior minister denied Lansky's application, citing findings from the 1950 and 1951 Kefauver hearings. Lansky sued, and the case reached Israel's Supreme Court, which ruled against him in September 1972. After a legal battle lasting roughly 2 years, Lansky was deported back to the United States and arrested by federal agents as soon as he landed at Miami International Airport. Prosecutors brought him to trial using testimony from a cooperating witness, a loan shark named Vincent Fat Vinny Teresa. In February 1973, a federal judge found Lansky in contempt of court for refusing to answer questions before a grand jury, though that conviction was later overturned on appeal. In July 1973, a federal court in Miami acquitted Lansky of the tax evasion charges tied to the Flamingo case. Chronic health problems played a role in how the case unfolded. Lansky had already suffered a heart attack more than a decade earlier and continued to struggle with poor health through the proceedings. By 1974, a federal judge declined to fully dismiss related charges, but effectively allowed the case to sit unresolved rather than pursue it further. Lansky would spend the rest of his life barred from returning to Israel, despite repeated efforts by lawyers and friends there to secure him even a temporary visit. He spent his final decade living quietly in Miami Beach, Florida, largely out of the public eye. Federal authorities continued to claim that Lansky had hidden as much as $300 million somewhere beyond the reach of taxation, a figure that fed decades of legend about a secret fortune. Lansky himself maintained that he was close to broke. When he died of lung cancer on January 15, 1983, at age 80, his estate turned out to be modest, and no hidden financial empire was ever found or documented by investigators or historians who examined his affairs afterward. He was given an Orthodox Jewish funeral, the same tradition observed decades earlier for his old associate Arnold Rothstein. His memory lived on in popular culture, largely through the character of Hyman Roth in The Godfather Part 2, a role widely understood to be based on him. According to accounts from people close to both men, Lansky called actor Lee Strasberg after the film's premiere to compliment his performance, though he suggested the writers could have made his character a bit more sympathetic. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Lansky spent his life avoiding the violence that surrounded almost everyone close to him, and he outlived nearly all of them. His oldest friend and partner, the man he built his very first criminal operation with on the streets of the Lower East Side, was not so fortunate. And the story of how that friendship ended in a Beverly Hills living room in 1947 still has no confirmed ending. Section 2. Bugsy Siegel, the Flamingo and the Unsolved Hit. Benjamin Siegel was born on February 28, 1906, in the Williamsburg section of Brooklyn, the second of 5 children born to Max and Jenny Siegel, Jewish immigrants from Russia. The family lived in a cramped, rat-infested apartment across the river from the Lower East Side of Manhattan. His father worked long hours for little pay, and Siegel grew up watching that hard labor buy his family almost nothing. By his early teens, he had already decided he wanted no part of that life, and by 14, he had started his own street gang. His first criminal enterprise was simple and cruel. He and a partner named Mo Sedway offered to protect pushcart peddlers' carts from theft and vandalism in exchange for regular payments. When a peddler refused to pay, which most did at first, Siegel would douse the cart in kerosene and set it on fire, then return with the same offer. Fellow gang members later said Siegel had a temper that could turn violent in seconds, and they nicknamed him Bugsy, meaning crazy as a bedbug. Siegel hated the nickname his entire life and rarely let anyone use it to his face. As a teenager on the Lower East Side, Siegel met Meyer Lansky, who was working to organize the neighborhood's Jewish youth into something more structured than scattered street gangs. Lansky recruited Siegel early, and the two formed the Bugs and Meyer mob, a gang that ran bootleg liquor during Prohibition and also worked as hired muscle for other criminal operations across New York and New Jersey. The gang hijacked liquor shipments from rival bootleggers and carried out killings on behalf of other gangs nearly a decade before the more famous hit squad known as Murder Inc. was formally organized. Around the same time, both Siegel and Lansky built connections to Charlie Lucky Luciano, and by the late 1920s, the three were tied into a growing network that included future crime bosses Frank Costello, Joe Masseria, and Vito Genovese. In May 1929, Siegel and Lansky attended a meeting of major organized crime figures at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in Atlantic City, where Luciano and Chicago gang leader Johnny Torrio discussed uniting Italian, Jewish, and Irish criminal operations under one loosely organized structure instead of letting them fight each other over territory. Siegel reportedly told the group that Jewish and Italian gangs would no longer fight one another, a statement that captured the entire purpose of the meeting. That same year, on January 28, 1929, Siegel married his childhood sweetheart, Esta Krakauer. The couple had 2 daughters, Millicent and Barbara, and for a period lived what looked from the outside like a stable family life. But Siegel's criminal career kept expanding through the early 1930s. In 1931, he was one of 4 men hired to kill Sicilian mob boss Joe Masseria as part of Luciano's takeover of the New York Italian Mafia during the Castellamarese War, the same violent restructuring that helped put Lansky at the top of the emerging national crime syndicate. Siegel's reputation for being willing to kill without hesitation made him one of the most feared enforcers in the organization. By some estimates from historians who studied the syndicate's early hit squad activity, Siegel personally killed more than 30 men over the course of his criminal career, not counting killings he ordered or helped arrange. In 1936, on Lansky's advice, Siegel relocated to Southern California to expand the syndicate's reach to the West Coast. He moved his wife and daughters with him and settled into a lifestyle that mixed organized crime with Hollywood glamour. Siegel set up gambling operations, including offshore gambling ships anchored off the California coast beyond local police jurisdiction, and worked to bring existing prostitution, narcotics, and bookmaking operations under his control. He bought a large home in Beverly Hills, wore custom-tailored suits, and became a familiar face at Hollywood parties, rubbing shoulders with actors and studio executives. Actress Jean Harlow served as godmother to his older daughter, Millicent, and actor George Raft, known for playing gangsters on screen, became one of Siegel's closest personal friends and later testified as a character witness on his behalf in court. On November 22, 1939, Siegel and 3 associates, Whitey Krakow, Frankie Carbo, and Albert Tannenbaum, killed a man named Harry Greenberg outside his apartment in the Hollywood Hills. Greenberg was a former syndicate associate who had begun threatening to talk to police, and Louis Buchalter, the head of Murder Inc. back in New York, ordered him killed before he could inform on the organization. Tannenbaum was later arrested and agreed to testify against Siegel and the others involved. Siegel was indicted and stood trial for the Greenberg murder starting in September 1941. The trial drew heavy press attention, partly because of reports that Siegel received unusually comfortable treatment while held in jail awaiting trial, including refusing standard jail food, receiving visits from women, and being allowed outside leave for dental appointments. Siegel publicly denied that the stories about his treatment were accurate and insisted they were exaggerated. The case against him weakened significantly after a key witness in a related informant scheme was killed before trial, and Siegel was never convicted in the Greenberg case. Around 1945, while his marriage to Esta was falling apart under the weight of his repeated infidelity, Siegel began a relationship with Virginia Hill, a woman from Lipscomb, Alabama, who had built her own connections across the criminal underworld after running away from home as a teenager. Esta finally divorced Siegel in 1946 and moved back to New York with their 2 daughters, leaving Siegel to continue his life in California with Hill. It was around this same period that Siegel turned his attention to a small desert town in Nevada that most people at the time considered nothing more than a dusty stopover: Las Vegas. Nevada had legalized gambling in 1931, and Siegel, along with Lansky and other syndicate figures, believed the state offered a legal path to enormous gambling profits that prohibition-style bootlegging could never match. In 1946, Siegel took over a stalled casino project from businessman Wilkerson, a resort he named the Flamingo, reportedly inspired by Virginia Hill's long legs and the nickname some of her friends used for her. Siegel oversaw construction personally, promising a resort with the best food, the best liquor, and the biggest entertainers in the country, all offered at reasonable prices to draw in wealthy visitors from Los Angeles and beyond. The project quickly spiraled out of control. What began as a budget of roughly $1 million, funded by Lansky and a group of syndicate investors, ballooned to an estimated $6 million by the time the Flamingo opened its doors on December 26, 1946. Material shortages left over from the recently ended Second World War drove up costs, and Siegel's own demands for luxury finishes added even more. The hotel rooms were not fully finished when the casino opened, forcing early guests to gamble in an unfinished resort and then drive back into Los Angeles to sleep. A rare winter rainstorm kept many of the Hollywood celebrities Siegel had invited to the opening from being able to fly in at all. The Flamingo lost money through its first weeks of operation, and Siegel's partners back east grew convinced that some of the missing construction money, estimated at around $1 million, had been stolen, either by Siegel himself or by Virginia Hill, who was known to make frequent trips to Europe and was suspected of moving cash into a Swiss bank account. In December 1946, weeks before the Flamingo's troubled opening, major figures across the National Crime Syndicate gathered in Havana, Cuba, for a meeting hosted by Lansky and the recently deported Luciano at the Hotel Nacional. According to multiple biographers who later interviewed people connected to the syndicate, Siegel's mounting losses at the Flamingo were a central topic of discussion, and the group debated what to do about a man who had burned through 6 times his approved budget on a project that was not yet turning a profit. Lansky, who had known Siegel since they were teenagers on the Lower East Side, was reportedly reluctant to see his oldest friend killed over the matter, but according to several accounts, he eventually went along with the decision made by the wider group. On the night of June 20th, 1947, Siegel was sitting on a couch in the living room of a Beverly Hills mansion on North Linden Drive, a home he had leased for Virginia Hill, who was away in Paris after a recent argument with Siegel. He was reading a copy of the Los Angeles Times alongside his close friend and business associate Alan Smiley. At around 10:45 that night, an unknown gunman fired 9 rounds from a .30 caliber M1 carbine through the living room window from a spot just outside, resting the weapon on a garden trellis roughly 14 feet away. 4 bullets struck Siegel, 2 in the head and 2 in the chest, killing him instantly. 1 bullet struck him with enough force to knock one of his eyes completely out of its socket, and it was later found roughly 15 feet away on the tile floor. Smiley, seated beside him, took 3 bullets through the sleeve of his jacket, but was not hit and survived unharmed. The shooter disappeared into the night and was never identified or caught. 20 minutes after Siegel's death, according to multiple accounts gathered by historians and law enforcement at the time, associates connected to Lansky's network, including Mo Sedway and Gus Greenbaum, walked into the Flamingo and announced they were taking control of the casino. The timing struck investigators and journalists alike as far too coordinated to be a coincidence. Whoever had ordered Siegel's death appeared to already know it had happened and had people in place to move immediately. Police in Beverly Hills, along with investigators from the Los Angeles Police Department and the FBI, worked the case in the weeks and months that followed, but the killing was never solved. Forensic examination of the crime scene led one senior specialist with the Beverly Hills Police Department to conclude that 2 shooters were likely involved, rather than 1, based on the precision of the shots to Siegel's head, since a single gunman would likely have seen the target's head turn away after the first impact. No one was ever arrested or formally charged. Investigators considered several competing theories over the following decades. One held that Jack Dragna, the head of the Los Angeles branch of the Mafia, ordered the hit, with the approval of Lansky and Luciano, because Dragna resented Siegel's growing power on the West Coast. Another focused on Virginia Hill, noting that she left for Europe just days before the murder, and had known ties to organized crime figures in Chicago, raising suspicion that she may have fed information about Siegel's schedule to people planning the killing. A third theory centered on Siegel's own bodyguard, a young Cleveland transplant named Mickey Cohen, who was not present the night of the murder despite normally guarding Siegel closely, and who inherited control of much of Siegel's West Coast gambling operation once Siegel was gone. Virginia Hill was called before the Kefauver Committee, the Senate investigation into organized crime, in the early 1950s to answer questions about her finances and her relationship with Siegel, though she was never charged in connection with his death. She moved to Europe permanently afterward and died in Austria in 1966 of an overdose of sleeping pills at age 49. Siegel's ex-wife, Esta, always maintained publicly that her former husband had been a good man underneath his reputation, and she raised their daughters in New York largely apart from the criminal world he had built. Millicent Siegel, his older daughter, lived until 2017 and was given a Jewish burial in Las Vegas, a city her father helped create but never lived to see fully succeed. The Flamingo itself, once freed of Siegel's spending, became profitable within a few years under new management connected to Lansky's network, and it helped launch Las Vegas into the gambling capital it remains today. The Beverly Hills Police Department's file on the case, listed under case number 46176, remains officially open. Because the murder was never solved, researchers and historians have not been permitted to view the full file. Decades later, in 2012, a retired police captain who had worked the case shared with reporters his own frustration at watching every witness and suspect connected to the killing die of old age or unrelated causes without ever providing a confession that stuck. Siegel is remembered today with two memorial plaques, one at the Flamingo in Las Vegas near its wedding chapel, and another far from the glamour of the casino floor, inside the Bialystoker Synagogue on New York's Lower East Side. The same neighborhood where a poor immigrant boy once set fire to pushcarts for spare change. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Siegel's death also marked a turning point for the man who had once employed him as a bodyguard and who inherited much of his territory once he was gone. That man built his own reputation over the following decade as one of the most heavily targeted gangsters in American history, surviving what he claimed were 11 separate attempts on his life. His story picks up next, starting with a bombed house in Brentwood that left his 200 tailor-made suits in ruins. Section 3. Mickey Cohen, the man who wouldn't die. Meyer Harris Cohen was born on September 4, 1913, in New York City to Jewish parents who had immigrated from Kiev in the Russian Empire, in what is now Ukraine. He was the youngest of 6 children, and his father died when Cohen was still a toddler, leaving his mother to raise the family largely on her own. While he was still young, the family moved across the country to the Boyle Heights neighborhood of Los Angeles. His older brothers ran a drugstore during Prohibition, and Cohen spent time helping out there as a boy. By age 8, Cohen was already working, selling newspapers on a street corner to help bring in money. At 14, he was sent to reform school for petty crimes, including shoplifting and theft. As a teenager, he took up boxing, first in illegal prize fights around Los Angeles, and then, starting in 1929, as a professional fighter under the name Mickey Cohen. His first documented professional bout came on April 8, 1930, in Cleveland, a preliminary card win against a fighter named Patsy Farr. He fought mostly in Cleveland, along with a handful of bouts in Chicago and Los Angeles, and finished his career with a modest record of 7 wins, 11 losses, and 1 draw. Standing only about 5 feet 4 inches tall, Cohen fought with an aggressive, scrappy style that made up for his lack of size, though it never translated into a winning record. It was during one of these fights that a ring announcer or opponent dubbed him Gangster Mickey Cohen, a nickname that would end up describing his life far more accurately than his boxing record ever did. Cohen's time boxing in Cleveland introduced him to organized crime associates connected to bootlegger Mo Dalitz, a man who would later become a major figure in the development of Las Vegas. Those contacts eventually connected Cohen to New York crime figures Meyer Lansky and Lucky Luciano, both of whom were always looking for reliable muscle. Cohen also spent time working for Al Capone's old organization in Chicago, known as The Outfit, running a small gambling operation for them during the final years of Prohibition. In 1939, Cohen moved back to Los Angeles with a specific assignment: serve as a bodyguard for Bugsy Siegel, the syndicate's man overseeing California operations. Cohen worked under Siegel through the 1940s, helping run gambling operations and, according to later accounts, taking part in the kind of violence that came with the territory. He also began building his own legitimate front businesses, including a men's clothing store on Sunset Boulevard, which gave him a public face as a colorful local business owner, even as his real income came from illegal gambling and vice. When Siegel was shot and killed in his girlfriend's Beverly Hills home on June 20th, 1947, Cohen was notably not doing his job that night. He was not present as Siegel's bodyguard, despite normally staying close to him. And in the aftermath of the murder, he was named by some investigators and later true crime writers as one of several people who could have had knowledge of the hit in advance. He was never charged in connection with Siegel's death. With Siegel gone, East Coast crime bosses chose Cohen to take over the syndicate's gambling and vice operations across Southern California, passing over Jack Dragna, the longtime head of the Los Angeles branch of the Italian Mafia, who had controlled much of the city's rackets since 1931, when he took over following the disappearance of previous boss Joseph Artizzoni. Dragna, sometimes called the Capone of Los Angeles by local papers, had spent more than a decade building his own organization, and being passed over in favor of a former bodyguard from Cleveland created a deep and immediate rivalry. What followed became known to newspapers and later historians as the War of the Sunset Strip, a string of shootings, bombings, and ambushes that stretched across Los Angeles for the better part of 2 years. The violence started almost as soon as Siegel was in the ground. Cohen was ambushed multiple times as Dragna's men tried repeatedly to kill him. In one attack, gunmen opened fire on Cohen's car with shotguns and a Tommy gun as he drove home to Brentwood. Flying glass cut into him as his windshield exploded, but he managed to keep control of the car and drove himself to safety without further injury. In another incident, while Cohen sat with friends in a crowded diner, a gunman outside fired a rifle through the window, tearing flesh from his arm, while a second shooter's buckshot wounded a couple of uninvolved customers inside. On a separate occasion, as Cohen walked toward his car and bent down to look at a scratch on the fender, a bullet passed close enough to his head that he heard it whistle by before it ricocheted off the vehicle. The shooter fled without firing again. Cohen's rivalry with the LAPD ran alongside his rivalry with Dragna. In 1949, Cohen became entangled in a separate scandal involving a Los Angeles madam named Brenda Allen, who ran a prostitution operation employing more than 100 women and pulling in thousands of dollars a day. Allen was protected by an LAPD Vice Squad sergeant named Elmer Jackson, who was also reportedly her lover. During a court appearance in May 1949, unrelated to the Allen case, Cohen casually mentioned that he possessed recordings of phone calls between Allen and Jackson, calls that had been placed to and from LAPD headquarters itself. Cohen separately claimed that 2 police officials, Sergeant Jackson and a lieutenant named Rudy Wellpot, had been extorting money from him directly. The resulting scandal forced the resignation of LAPD Police Chief Clements Horrell under threat of a grand jury investigation into perjury, along with an assistant chief. The affair exposed just how deep the financial relationships ran between organized crime figures like Cohen and the police department that was supposedly working to stop them. The most serious attack on Cohen came in the early morning hours of July 20th, 1949, outside Sherry's, a restaurant on the Sunset Strip popular with both movie stars and mobsters. At 3:55 in the morning, as Cohen and his group left the restaurant, gunmen hidden across the street opened fire. Cohen instinctively crouched at the exact moment the shooting began, a reaction that likely saved his life. He was hit in the shoulder, making him the least seriously wounded person in his group. His newly assigned bodyguard, a state agent named Harry Cooper, was shot twice in the stomach. Cohen's longtime friend and enforcer, Edward Nettie Herbert, was hit multiple times and left paralyzed from the waist down. He died of his injuries within days. A young woman dining with the group that night was also shot in the back. No one was ever charged with the shooting. Some investigators later suspected it may not have come from Dragna at all, but from the same corrupt Los Angeles police officers Cohen had recently accused of extorting money from him. A theory that gained traction because Cohen was expected to testify before a grand jury investigating police corruption around the same time. Around 1950, a bomb went off inside Cohen's home in the wealthy Brentwood neighborhood of Los Angeles. Cohen and his wife, LaVon, survived the blast without serious injury, though the explosion destroyed a large portion of his wardrobe, which, by his own account, included roughly 200 custom-tailored suits. Rather than back down, Cohen turned the house into something closer to a small fortress, installing floodlights, alarm systems, and a stockpile of weapons that he reportedly kept, half joking, right next to what remained of his suit collection. He also had a Cadillac specially built with armor plating strong enough to stop a .38 caliber armor-piercing round, a step up from standard armored cars of the period, which were typically only rated to stop smaller rounds. A small custom shop outside Los Angeles built the car for him over the summer of 1950, matching the appearance of a standard Cadillac 60 Special as closely as possible so it would not draw attention, while still offering far more protection than an ordinary vehicle. Over the following years, by his own count and the count of several biographers, Cohen survived roughly a dozen attempts on his life in total, a number that made him one of the most heavily targeted organized crime figures in American history. In 1950 and 1951, the Senate Select Committee on Organized Crime in Interstate Commerce, widely known as the Kefauver Committee, held nationally televised hearings investigating organized crime across the country, and Cohen's flamboyant lifestyle and public visibility made him one of the hearing's most talked about witnesses. When a senator pressed him about being surrounded by violence, Cohen reportedly shot back that people were shooting at him, a response that captured his blunt, unapologetic public persona. Despite his sharp tongue in front of the cameras, the investigation that followed the hearings led directly to his downfall. In June 1951, Cohen was convicted of federal income tax evasion and sentenced to 4 years in prison. It was the same legal strategy that had brought down Al Capone 2 decades earlier, since prosecutors often found it far easier to prove a gangster had hidden income from the IRS than to prove involvement in any specific violent crime. Despite widespread suspicion that Cohen had a hand in several killings over the years, police were never able to gather enough evidence to charge him with murder. After his release, Cohen returned to Los Angeles and continued operating a mix of legitimate businesses and illegal rackets throughout the 1950s. In 1957, he sat for a live television interview with journalist Mike Wallace, who would later become known for his long career on 60 Minutes, giving Cohen even wider public exposure as a kind of celebrity gangster. Around this time, Cohen hired a bodyguard named Johnny Stompanato, a man with his own history of violence and womanizing. Stompanato began dating actress Lana Turner, and in April 1958, Turner's 14-year-old daughter, Cheryl Crane, stabbed and killed Stompanato in what was ruled a killing carried out in defense of her mother, following allegations that Stompanato had been violent and threatening. Cohen paid for Stompanato's funeral, reportedly out of a mix of loyalty and spite, then handed private love letters between Turner and Stompanato over to the press, apparently trying to undercut public sympathy for Turner and her daughter by painting a different picture of the relationship. In 1961, with United States Attorney General Robert Kennedy personally taking an interest in the case, federal prosecutors convicted Cohen a second time on tax evasion charges. And this time, the sentence was far harsher. 15 years, a term longer than the one that had put his old role model Al Capone behind bars 3 decades earlier. Cohen was sent first to Alcatraz, the maximum security island prison in San Francisco Bay. In an unusual turn, he became the only prisoner ever released from Alcatraz on bail, after United States Supreme Court Chief Justice Earl Warren personally signed his $100,000 bond in October 1961. The bail did not last. After his appeals failed, Cohen was returned to Alcatraz in May 1962, and in January 1963, shortly before Alcatraz closed permanently, he was transferred to the federal penitentiary in Atlanta, Georgia. It was in Atlanta that Cohen suffered the injury that would define the rest of his life. On August 14, 1963, while Cohen sat taking part in electronics repair training inside the prison, a fellow inmate named Burl Estes McDonald slipped out of a separate part of the facility and approached him from behind, carrying a 3-foot length of iron pipe. McDonald struck Cohen in the head without warning, fracturing his skull and driving bone fragments into the surrounding brain tissue. Cohen underwent extensive emergency neurosurgery, spent roughly 2 weeks in a coma, and ultimately had a steel plate inserted into the back of his skull to replace the damaged bone. He survived, but the attack left him partially paralyzed and dependent on help simply moving around for the rest of his life. He later filed a $10 million lawsuit against the federal government, arguing that prison officials had been negligent in failing to prevent the assault. Cohen was released from prison for good in 1972 and returned to something like public life, appearing on television talk shows with the same blunt, colorful personality that had made him a media fixture 2 decades earlier, despite his lingering injuries. He spent time visiting old associates, including New Orleans crime boss Carlos Marcello, and gave interviews to reporters who found him surprisingly candid about his past. In 1974, he had one final strange brush with a major news story when heiress Patty Hearst was kidnapped by the Symbionese Liberation Army. Cohen claimed to have connections that could help negotiate her release, but the offer went nowhere once it became clear that Hearst had, at least outwardly, joined her captors rather than sought rescue from them. Mickey Cohen died on July 29, 1976, in Los Angeles at age 62, following complications from stomach cancer surgery. He had outlived Bugsy Siegel by nearly 30 years, along with most of the men who had tried to kill him during the War of the Sunset Strip. Despite decades of violence around him, suspected involvement in multiple killings, and 2 federal prison sentences, he died of natural causes rather than a bullet, a fact that several biographers who studied his life have called almost unbelievable, given how many people had tried to make sure it ended differently. His armored Cadillac outlived him by decades as well, eventually passing through the hands of the Los Angeles Police Department and several private collectors before ending up in a car museum on the other side of the world in New Zealand. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Cohen built his career protecting a man from Brooklyn who never saw the same amount of luck extended to him. Back on the East Coast, while Cohen was still fighting off bullets on the Sunset Strip, the syndicate's own hired killing operation had already been exposed, taken apart in court, and sent to its end in the electric chair years earlier. That story starts with a boy who robbed pushcarts on the Lower East Side and grew up to run as many as 250 hired killers under one roof. Section 4. Louis Lepke Buchalter, the only mob boss ever executed. Louis Buchalter was born in mid-February 1897 on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, one of 13 children in a large blended Jewish family. His parents, Barnett and Rose Buchalter, were Russian Jewish immigrants, and both had children from earlier marriages before having several more together, Louis among them. As a boy, he was described as an excellent student at the Rabbi Jacob Joseph School, and his siblings went on to respectable careers. One became a pharmacist, another a rabbi and college teacher, a third a dentist. Louis was the only one of the children who turned to crime. His mother nicknamed him Lepkele, meaning Little Louis in Yiddish, and the shortened version, Lepke, stuck with him for the rest of his life. His father died in 1909 when Louis was 12. A year later, his mother, in poor health, moved to Arizona, leaving young Louis in the care of his older sister in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. Without a parent to answer to, he drifted into petty theft, robbing pushcarts on the street for spare change. It was during one of these robberies that he met a boy named Jacob Shapiro, who would earn the nickname Gura, reportedly from the way he slurred the phrase, "Get out of here," at anyone in his way. The two became partners, and their partnership would define both of their lives for the next 2 decades. Buchalter was arrested for the first time in 1915, at age 18, on burglary and assault charges. Over the following years, he cycled in and out of New York prisons, including a stretch at Sing Sing for grand larceny and a later sentence for burglarizing a women's clothing store. He was transferred at different points to Auburn Prison and to Great Meadow Prison in Comstock, New York, before his release in early 1919. He was arrested again within months on an attempted burglary charge, but was discharged, then arrested once more in January 1920 for burglarizing a women's clothing store, and sent back to Sing Sing for another 2.5 years. By the time he was released for good in March 1922, he had served roughly 5 years behind bars combined. Once out, Buchalter and Shapiro, who had already been free since 1919, decided to try a different kind of crime, one with far less risk of getting caught red-handed and far more money attached to it. Following the model used by an earlier Lower East Side extortionist known as Dopey Benny Fine, they began working as hired muscle for garment industry unions and manufacturers, the same racket that other Lower East Side gangs had already been running for years. Using threats of violence and staged labor strikes, The two men slowly took control of union leadership positions across the garment, fur, leather, baking, and trucking industries in New York and parts of New Jersey. Business owners were forced to pay regular fees, which Buchalter and Shapiro referred to as dues, in exchange for what they called labor peace. Refusing to pay usually meant a sudden strike, sabotage, or violence against a factory or its workers. The two men also dipped directly into union bank accounts they controlled, extracting money from both sides of the labor disputes they manufactured. By 1935, law enforcement officials estimated that Buchalter and Shapiro had roughly 250 men working under them, and that Buchalter alone was earning more than $1 million a year, worth well over $20 million in modern terms. New York City Police Commissioner Louis Valentine named him among the 9 most dangerous criminals in the entire country that same year. In 1927, years before his labor racketeering empire reached its peak, Buchalter and Shapiro were arrested and charged with the murder of Jacob Little Augie Organ, a Lower East Side gang leader they had once worked under, along with the attempted murder of a rival bootlegger named Jack Legs Diamond. Both charges were eventually dropped for lack of evidence, and Organ's death cleared the way for Buchalter and Shapiro to take over what had been his operation and expand it into the labor racket that would define the rest of Buchalter's career. Despite his growing fortune, Buchalter avoided the flashy lifestyle many other gangsters embraced. He dressed simply, favored plain fedoras, and rarely raised his voice, even around men who feared him. He married a widow named Betty Wasserman in 1931 and adopted her son from a previous marriage, and the couple lived comfortably in an apartment facing Central Park, complete with a large black automobile and regular vacations to Europe. He also owned the Rio Bamba, an upscale Manhattan nightclub, giving him a legitimate-looking business front to go along with his union rackets. His own gang, made up of thugs and killers who called him Judge Louie or simply the Judge, feared him more than they feared his loud, physically intimidating partner, Shapiro. One of his men later described the relationship simply. He did not ask questions, he only obeyed, because it was healthier that way. Buchalter also formed a working alliance with Tommy Lucchese, a rising figure in New York's Italian Mafia, and the two men together controlled much of the city's garment district for years, an arrangement that showed how deeply intertwined Jewish and Italian rackets had become in a single industry. Around 1929, Buchalter became connected to the same expanding national network that included Charlie Luciano, Meyer Lansky, Bugsy Siegel, and Frank Costello, joining as one of the founding figures behind what would become known as the National Crime Syndicate. Within this new structure, Buchalter took on a role separate from labor racketeering. In the early 1930s, working alongside Brooklyn mob figure Albert Anastasia, he built an organized system for carrying out contract killings on behalf of Cosa Nostra bosses across the country. The system had no official name at the time. Journalists later gave it the label that stuck permanently in American history: Murder, Inc. The killing operation worked with business-like structure. Anastasia served as the point man, receiving approval from senior mob leadership for a particular killing, then passing the order down to Buchalter. Buchalter would select the right man for the job from his pool of killers and pass along the contract, while giving the assigned killer as little information as possible, since less knowledge meant less risk if that killer was ever caught and questioned by police. Timing and method were typically left up to the killer's own judgment, and many of the men involved reportedly took a strange kind of pride in doing the work efficiently and without unnecessary mess. Investigators who later studied the organization's activities estimated it carried out more than 100 killings nationwide over the course of roughly a decade, using methods ranging from shootings to ice pick stabbings to strangulation, all directed at rivals, informants, and anyone the syndicate's leadership decided needed to be removed. By the mid-1930s, New York State prosecutors were closing in on Buchalter's labor racketeering empire. In 1935, Governor Herbert Lehman appointed a young lawyer named Thomas Dewey as special prosecutor, specifically to investigate labor extortion in New York. And Dewey's team built a case focused heavily on Buchalter and Shapiro's control over the garment unions, including their scheme forcing fur dealers to pay for protection through a pair of businesses called the Protective Fur Dressers Corporation and the Fur Dressers Factor Corporation. As the pressure mounted, Buchalter grew increasingly paranoid about who might be talking to Dewey's investigators. In September 1936, he became convinced, without solid proof, that a Brooklyn candy store owner named Joseph Rosen was cooperating with the prosecution. Rosen had previously worked as a garment trucker before Buchalter forced him out of the trucking business and set him up with the candy store instead, as a kind of consolation for taking away his livelihood. When Buchalter demanded that Rosen leave New York entirely and Rosen refused, Buchalter ordered him killed. On the morning of September 13, 1936, as Rosen opened his shop for the day, 3 or 4 gunmen entered and shot him 15 times, killing him instantly. No one was arrested for the murder at the time, and the case sat unsolved for years. 2 months later, in November 1936, Buchalter and Shapiro were convicted of violating federal antitrust laws connected to their control over the rabbit fur dressing industry, receiving what the trial judge himself publicly called a mere slap on the wrist, 2-year prison terms and $10,000 fines, with the judge openly urging lawmakers to provide harsher penalties for this kind of crime in the future. Rather than report to prison once their appeals ran out, the 2 men decided to disappear. In July 1937, with help from associate Albert Anastasia, Buchalter and Shapiro went into hiding. While they were on the run, federal prosecutors also indicted Buchalter on a separate charge of conspiring to smuggle heroin into the country. As the manhunt intensified, Buchalter used Murder, Inc. killers to silence witnesses cooperating with Dewey's investigation. One of his own longtime associates, a man named Max Rubin, was tracked down and shot in the head after repeatedly returning to New York to see his family, despite being warned to leave town. Rubin survived the shooting, but Dewey used the attack to build public support for his prosecution and to fuel his own successful campaign for Manhattan District Attorney, a race he won in 1938 despite running in a heavily Democratic borough. The manhunt for Buchalter became a national story. Rewards for information leading to his capture climbed from $5,000 to $25,000 and eventually as high as $50,000. His photograph appeared on wanted posters, in movie theater newsreels, and across newspapers nationwide. And rumors placed him hiding everywhere from Poland to Puerto Rico to Palestine. In reality, Buchalter never left New York City. He spent nearly 2 years hiding in plain sight in Manhattan and Brooklyn, while investigators searched the globe for him. Shapiro, in poor health and worn down by the constant pressure of hiding, surrendered to federal authorities on April 14, 1938, later telling agents he felt like he was in jail anyway, given how relentlessly he was being hunted wherever he went. Buchalter held out even longer. In August 1939, he arranged through newspaper columnist Walter Winchell to surrender directly to FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, reportedly believing he had struck a deal that would keep him in federal custody on the narcotics charge, rather than being handed over to New York State to face Dewey and the labor racketeering case. There was no such deal. Federal prosecutors convicted him on the narcotics trafficking charge in September 1939, and he was sentenced to 14 years at Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary in Kansas. New York State authorities also convicted him separately on the labor extortion charges in April 1940, adding a sentence of 30 years to life, though he was sent to serve his federal time first. Buchalter's real downfall began while he sat in Leavenworth. In 1940, Brooklyn prosecutors investigating Murder, Inc. flipped one of the operation's own killers, a man named Abe Rellis, turning him into a cooperating witness in exchange for protection from the death penalty for his own crimes. Rellis told investigators he had personally overheard Buchalter give the order for Joseph Rosen's murder back in 1936. Based largely on that testimony, Buchalter was transferred out of federal custody and arraigned in New York State Court in May 1941 on the Rosen killing, along with 3 additional murders. A second Murder, Inc. informant, Albert Tannenbaum, also agreed to testify against him, corroborating much of what Relis had already told prosecutors. The trial moved quickly once it began. On November 30th, 1941, after roughly 4 hours of jury deliberation, Buchalter was found guilty of first-degree murder. 2 of his top lieutenants, Emmanuel Mendy Weiss and Louis Capone, no relation to Al Capone, were convicted alongside him for their roles in planning and carrying out the Rosen killing. On December 2nd, 1941, all 3 men were sentenced to death by electrocution, with the execution originally scheduled for early January 1942. Buchalter's legal team filed appeal after appeal, pushing the case all the way to the New York Court of Appeals and eventually to the United States Supreme Court. In October 1942, the state appeals court upheld his conviction by a narrow 4-3 vote, with the dissenting judges arguing that the trial's jury instructions had been flawed enough to justify a new trial. Buchalter's execution date was pushed back 5 separate times over the following 2 years as the appeals process dragged on, a delay that meant Thomas Dewey, the man who had spent years pursuing him, eventually became governor of New York and held the power to grant Buchalter clemency, a power Dewey chose not to use. By early March 1944, every legal option had run out. Buchalter and his co-defendants spent their final hours going through the same routine given to every condemned man at Sing Sing: showering, changing into white socks, carpet slippers, and black trousers, with a slit cut into one leg to allow an electrode to be attached to bare skin. Buchalter chose steak, French fries, salad, and pie for his final lunch, and roast chicken with shoestring potatoes and salad for dinner. On the afternoon of March 2nd, Buchalter reportedly asked to speak privately with a Manhattan prosecutor, a conversation that fed weeks of rumors that he was finally willing to trade information on other syndicate figures in exchange for his life. No such deal ever materialized, and his lawyer later gave a cryptic statement suggesting Buchalter had chosen silence over cooperation, even at the very end. On the night of March 4th, 1944, Buchalter, Weiss, and Capone were executed one after another in the electric chair at Sing Sing prison, an execution device nicknamed Old Sparky by the guards and press. Weiss went first, accompanied by a rabbi, telling witnesses he was innocent and asking that his love be passed on to his family. Buchalter followed a few minutes later, also accompanied by a rabbi. He wore his own gray trousers and an open-necked white shirt, rather than the standard prison clothing, and he said nothing before he was strapped into the chair. Glancing briefly around the room at the 36 official witnesses gathered to watch. He was declared dead at 11:16 that night, at age 47. A reporter present that night described sweat beading on Buchalter's forehead and his face changing color in the final moments, calling it a sight no one could easily look away from. Buchalter remains, to this day, the only major boss within the American National Crime Syndicate ever executed after being convicted of murder. His execution effectively marked the end of Murder, Inc. as an organized killing operation, since the trials and testimony that brought him down had already exposed much of the group's structure and prosecutors. He was buried at Mount Hebron Cemetery in Queens, and his old partner Jacob Shapiro, who had turned himself in years earlier, was separately convicted of extortion and conspiracy in May 1944, receiving a sentence of 15 years to life. Buchalter's wife, Betty, delivered a final written statement from him after his death, insisting he had never offered information in exchange for a commuted sentence, and had asked only that a commission examine the facts of his case, a request that went nowhere and changed nothing about the outcome that had already been decided in the courtroom. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Buchalter built and ran his hit squad through men who followed his orders without asking questions, trusting that discipline and silence would protect them all. That trust collapsed the moment one of his own killers decided that testifying against his boss was worth more to him than staying loyal. And it cost that informant everything, just months before he was set to take the witness stand one final time, falling from a 6th-floor hotel window while 3 police officers were supposedly guarding him around the clock. Section 5. Abe Reles, the canary who couldn't fly. Abraham Reles was born on May 10, 1906, in the Brownsville section of Brooklyn, the son of Jewish immigrants from Galicia, a region that was then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. His father worked in the garment trade before eventually selling knishes on the street during the hardest years of the Great Depression. Reles left school after the 8th grade and began spending his time in local pool halls and candy stores around Brownsville, the same kind of neighborhood hangouts that produced dozens of young men who drifted into organized crime during that era. His first run-in with police came in 1921, when he was arrested for stealing $2 worth of gum from a vending machine. It was a small beginning to a criminal career that would eventually make him one of the most feared and most prolific killers connected to organized crime in American history. As a teenager, Reles took the nickname Kid Twist, borrowed from an earlier New York gangster named Max Kid Twist Zworbach. He was short and physically unremarkable, but his size never stopped him from becoming known as one of the most violently unpredictable men in Brooklyn. His weapon of choice for murder was an ice pick, which he would drive through a victim's ear and into the brain, a method investigators later linked to numerous killings across Brooklyn during the 1930s. His temper extended well beyond his criminal business. On one occasion, according to accounts collected by prosecutors and later journalists, he assaulted a car wash worker in broad daylight for failing to clean a smudge off his fender. On another occasion, he killed a parking lot attendant simply for being too slow retrieving his car. He reportedly viewed killing almost as routine work rather than something requiring justification, once telling associates that, beyond being paid for it, killing was simply a duty. During Prohibition, Reles and childhood friends Martin Goldstein and Harry Strauss worked for the Shapiro brothers, a Brooklyn gang that controlled much of the local rackets at the time. As they grew more capable and ambitious, tension developed between Reles's group and the Shapiros, eventually escalating into open violence. In one incident, after being lured into what turned out to be an ambush, Reles, Goldstein, and an associate named George DeFeo were shot and wounded, though none of them died. In retaliation for the growing conflict, one of the Shapiro brothers reportedly kidnapped Reles's girlfriend and assaulted her. The feud eventually ended with the deaths of the Shapiro brothers, clearing the way for Reles and his partners to take over the rackets themselves. Through a connection with George DeFeo, Reles and his group eventually struck a business arrangement with Meyer Lansky, who wanted access to the poorer Brooklyn neighborhoods of Brownsville, East New York, and Ocean Hill for gambling and other rackets. The deal benefited both sides. Lansky gained a foothold in territory he otherwise had no natural claim to, and Reles gained the backing of one of the most powerful men in organized crime, which helped keep both his business and his life secure. Reles, Goldstein, and Strauss expanded from slot machines into loan sharking, illegal dice games, and violent enforcement connected to local labor unions, particularly within the restaurant industry. In 1934, Reles and Strauss were charged with attacking 2 black garage workers in an altercation that escalated into violence. One of the men, Charles Battles, confronted Reles over a disturbance, and Reles and Strauss beat him. Later that same morning, the 2 men allegedly returned and stabbed a second man, Alvin Snyder, killing him after apparently mistaking him for Battles. The murder charge against Strauss was later dropped for lack of evidence, but Reles was convicted of a lesser charge of second-degree murder for the assault on Battles and served 3 years in prison. The judge presiding over the case was openly critical of the jury's decision to convict on a reduced charge, describing Reles as more dangerous than the notorious bank robber John Dillinger, though lacking Dillinger's nerve. By the early 1930s, Reles had become connected to Albert Anastasia, a senior Brooklyn mob figure who would later rise to lead the Gambino crime family, and to Louis Lepke Buchalter, the labor racketeer who ran the syndicate's organized killing operation, later known to the press as Murder, Inc. Anastasia acted as a conduit, passing kill orders down from the wider national crime syndicate, relaying instructions through an associate named Louis Capone to Reles and his crew in Brownsville. Relis later described his first major assignment in blunt terms to investigators, recalling that he was pointed toward a house, told which room a target lived in, and simply shot the man 5 times, one bullet passing through the back of his head and taking out an eye in the process. He recalled that Capone had always treated him well in return for the work. By 1935, when Relis was still in his late 20s, newspapers were already referring to his crew as the Relis Mob, a recognition of how much influence he had built in just a few short years. Relis and his associates operated largely out of a 24-hour candy store in Brownsville called Midnight Roses, which served as a meeting point and, on at least one occasion, the site of a murder carried out inside its back room. Investigators and historians who later studied the group estimated that the killing operation built around Buchalter, Anastasia, and enforcers like Relis carried out somewhere between 400 and 1,000 contract killings nationwide between roughly 1930 and 1940, most of which were never solved at the time they occurred. Relis's own criminal record eventually caught up with him. By 1940, at age 34, he had been arrested 42 times, 6 of those arrests specifically for murder, and had already served 6 separate prison terms. Facing the possibility of yet another murder prosecution, and fully aware of what the electric chair meant for men convicted of contract killing in New York State, Relis made the decision that would define the rest of his short life. On March 23, 1940, he began speaking to Brooklyn District Attorney William O'Dwyer, agreeing to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for protection from execution for his own crimes. What followed was one of the most significant informant cooperation efforts in the history of American organized crime prosecution. Relis provided investigators with names, dates, and locations connected to roughly 70 unsolved contract murders carried out by the network prosecutors would come to call Murder, Inc. His information helped identify the killers behind cases stretching back years, including details that helped confirm who was behind the 1935 killing of gangster Dutch Schultz in Newark, New Jersey. Relis's testimony directly led to convictions and death sentences for several of his own former partners, including Martin Goldstein and Harry Strauss, the same men he had worked alongside for over a decade, both of whom were executed in the electric chair at Sing Sing in 1941, after Relis described in detail how they had killed and later burned the body of a man named Irving Puggy Feinstein, a killing that had taken place, according to Relis's own account, inside his mother's house. Relis's cooperation also proved central to the case that eventually sent Louis Buchalter to the electric chair in 1944, since his testimony that he personally overheard Buchalter order the 1936 murder of candy store owner Joseph Rosen became one of the key pieces of evidence prosecutors used against him. Brooklyn prosecutors even flew Relis across the country to Los Angeles to testify before a grand jury investigating the killing of Bugsy Siegel's associate, Harry Greenberg. Though, in that particular case, a different informant, Albert Tannenbaum, ultimately provided the testimony prosecutors relied on most heavily. By 1941, Relis was scheduled to deliver what would have been his most consequential testimony yet, aimed at Albert Anastasia himself, connecting him directly to the murder of a Union longshoreman named Pete Panto. Convicting Anastasia would have struck at one of the highest-ranking figures in the entire national crime syndicate, a man with deep connections across politics, law enforcement, and organized labor. Because the case against Anastasia rested almost entirely on Relis's word, keeping him alive long enough to testify became a matter of enormous importance to prosecutors, and an equally enormous problem for the syndicate leadership, who stood to lose everything if he made it to the witness stand. Relis was held for nearly a year in a 6th-floor suite at the Half Moon Hotel in Coney Island, under what was described as constant police protection, with as many as 18 officers rotating through guard shifts around the clock. During that time, he was allowed visits from his wife and other family members, and was transported under guard to and from various court appearances. He had already testified successfully in 3 separate Murder Inc. trials by the time his testimony against Anastasia was scheduled for the morning of November 12, 1941. Sometime between 3 and 6:30 that morning, with police officers stationed at the door to his room, Relis went out the 6th floor window. His body was found on a rooftop extension of the hotel, several floors below. Investigators found bed sheets tied together and a length of wire attached to a valve inside the room, suggesting Relis may have attempted to lower himself down to a 5th floor window before the knot connecting the wire to the valve came loose, sending him falling the rest of the way. The official conclusion reached by a grand jury investigation was that Relis died attempting an escape that went wrong. A conclusion many people close to the case, including law enforcement officials at the time and organized crime figures who spoke about it years later, found difficult to believe. 5 members of the police security detail assigned to protect him were demoted in the aftermath, and the officer in charge of the unit, Captain Frank Balls, gave testimony about the incident that investigators found inconsistent, though he was defended throughout by District Attorney O'Dwyer. With Relis dead, the case against Albert Anastasia collapsed entirely, since prosecutors had no other witness capable of connecting him to the Panto murder. Anastasia walked free and went on to seize control of the Mangano crime family a decade later, transforming it into the organization later known as the Gambino family, one of the most powerful of New York's 5 families, before he himself was assassinated in a barber shop in 1957. Newspapers at the time coined a phrase that has followed Relis's story ever since, dubbing him the canary who could sing but couldn't fly, a grim play on the informant nickname of Canary and the manner of his death. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Relis's cooperation, whatever its final cost to him personally, had already reshaped organized crime prosecution in New York before his death, giving investigators their clearest picture yet of how the syndicate's killing operation actually worked and who was directing it. His information had also, months earlier, given prosecutors the missing pieces they needed to finally understand exactly how one of New York's most notorious bootleggers had met his own violent end 6 years earlier in a restaurant bathroom in Newark. A killing carried out, like so many others tied to Relis's testimony, on direct orders from the very men running the syndicate he had once served without question. Section 6. Dutch Schultz, the Chop House Massacre. Arthur Flegenheimer was born in the Bronx on August 6, 1901, the second child of Hermann and Emma Flegenheimer, German Jewish immigrants who had married in Manhattan the year before. His father abandoned the family when Arthur was still a young teenager, and by the time of the 1910 census, his mother was listed as divorced. Years later, when applying for United States citizenship in 1932, Emma Flegenheimer stated that her husband had died in 1910, though it remains unclear whether that was true or simply easier to say than admitting he had walked out. Whatever the reason, Arthur grew up fatherless in the tenements of the Bronx, and like many boys in similar circumstances during that era, he left school early and turned to petty crime, starting with burglary. As a young man, he adopted the name Dutch Schultz, borrowing it from an older, tougher gangster who had operated in the same neighborhood years earlier. The new name gave him a certain reputation before he had even earned one, and he set out to live up to it. During Prohibition, Schultz partnered with a friend named Joey No to build a beer bootlegging operation in the Bronx, and the two men expanded aggressively into Manhattan, using intimidation to force existing saloon owners to buy their liquor instead of a rival's. Schultz was known to use extreme methods to enforce compliance. In one documented case, he kidnapped and tortured a bar owner who refused to purchase beer from his operation. This aggressive expansion into Manhattan brought Schultz into direct conflict with an established bootlegger named Legs Diamond, and the resulting rivalry turned violent. In October 1928, Joey No was shot and killed by members of Diamond's gang. According to several historical accounts, Schultz believed Diamond's associates were also connected to the killing of veteran gambler Arnold Rothstein, who was fatally shot the following month in November 1928, after a dispute connected to a card game debt. Rothstein's murder was never officially solved, and while some accounts have suggested Schultz ordered it in retaliation for No's death, this remains a theory rather than a proven fact. What is documented is that Legs Diamond himself was killed in 1931 in an attack widely attributed at the time to one of Schultz's men, continuing the pattern of violence that had defined the feud between the two operations for years. Schultz also fought a separate and even bloodier war with a former member of his own organization, Vincent Call, who broke away and began targeting Schultz's operations directly. The Schultz-Call War left a trail of dead men on both sides, before it ended in February 1932, when Call himself was killed, an act commonly attributed to men working for Schultz. Though, as with several other killings connected to this period, no one was ever formally convicted. As Prohibition wound down toward its eventual repeal in 1933, Schultz shifted his operations' focus toward illegal gambling, particularly a lottery-style betting operation known as the numbers racket or policy racket, which was especially popular and profitable in Harlem. His numbers operation there ran for years with substantial political protection. Years later, in the 1940s, James J. Hines, a powerful figure within the Tammany Hall political machine that controlled much of New York City's democratic politics, was convicted and sent to prison specifically for arranging that protection on Schultz's behalf, a case that illustrated just how deeply organized crime and city politics had become entangled during this period. Schultz's legal troubles caught up with him in 1933, when he was indicted on federal tax evasion charges, the same legal strategy that had already been used successfully against Al Capone. Rather than face arrest immediately, Schultz went into hiding for months before finally surrendering in November 1934. He stood trial twice on the tax charges in 1935. The first trial ended in a hung jury. For the second trial, held in the small upstate town of Malone, New York, Schultz worked to win over the local community, donating money to local businesses, giving toys to sick children, and buying new uniforms for the town's baseball team. The strategy worked. A jury made up largely of local farmers acquitted him, to the shock of much of the legal establishment. Locals had come to see him almost as a folk hero during the trial, with one resident reportedly asking a reporter why New York City was so eager to get rid of a man who had been so generous to their small town. New York City Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia was furious at the acquittal and publicly ordered that Schultz be arrested on sight if he ever returned to the city. Left with no choice, Schultz relocated his base of operations across the Hudson River into Newark, New Jersey. His legal defense during the tax trials had been expensive, and to help cover the cost, Schultz reduced the commission he paid to the men running his numbers operation, funneling the difference into what he openly called his defense fund. The reduced pay angered his own runners and operators enough that they organized a form of protest, despite the risk of violent retaliation for defying him. By 1935, Schultz faced yet another threat, this time from Thomas Dewey, a young special prosecutor who had built a career going after organized crime figures and who was now turning his full attention toward Schultz. Rather than accept another prolonged legal fight, Schultz brought a proposal to the Commission, the governing body overseeing the National Crime Syndicate, asking for permission to have Dewey killed before the prosecutor could bring new charges against him. Syndicate leadership, including Lucky Luciano, rejected the idea outright, arguing that assassinating a high-profile prosecutor would trigger a massive law enforcement crackdown on organized crime nationwide, undoing years of careful business arrangements. Schultz, enraged by the refusal, reportedly told the group he intended to kill Dewey regardless of their decision and stormed out of the meeting. According to accounts later given by Murder, Inc. prosecutor Burton Turkis, Albert Anastasia, disguised as a father pushing a baby carriage, staked out Dewey's Fifth Avenue apartment building to track his daily movements as part of Schultz's planning. When word of Schultz's continued intentions reached the commission, its members concluded that Schultz himself had become too great a liability to the entire syndicate and voted to have him killed before he could act. The job was handed to two experienced Murder, Inc. gunmen, Charles Workman and Emmanuel Mendy Weiss. On the night of October 23, 1935, Schultz and several of his top men, including financial advisor Otto Berman and bodyguards Abe Landau and Bernard Lulu Rosenkrantz, gathered at the Palace Chop House, a restaurant in Newark that Schultz had been using as his base since relocating from New York. At around 10:15 that night, while Schultz's men sat in a back room tallying the week's earnings from their gambling operations, at least 2 gunmen entered the restaurant and opened fire with a sawed-off shotgun and a pistol. Schultz happened to be in the men's room at the time and managed to duck away from the first shot fired at him. The second bullet struck him below the chest, passing through his body and damaging his stomach, large intestine, gallbladder, and liver on its way through. Despite their injuries, Landau and Rosenkrantz fought back. A bullet severed an artery in Landau's neck, and Rosenkrantz was hit multiple times at close range. Yet both men managed to rise and return fire, driving the attackers out of the restaurant. Workman, one of the shooters, reportedly went back to search Schultz's pockets after the shooting, though this detail has been disputed by later researchers, who question whether there was enough time, given that Landau and Rosenkrantz were still chasing the gunman. Weiss fled to the getaway car and ordered the driver to leave, abandoning Workman, who was forced to escape on foot, and reportedly confronted Weiss furiously afterward for leaving him behind. That same night, in a coordinated second wave of violence across the river in Manhattan, gunmen tracked down 2 more Schultz associates, Martin Krompier and Sam Gold, and shot both men in the city's theater district. Both survived their wounds. Schultz staggered out of the restroom after being shot and collapsed into a chair at his table, calling out for someone to get him an ambulance. All 4 wounded men, Schultz, Berman, Landau, and Rosenkrantz, were taken to Newark City Hospital. Schultz outlasted the others, but by the following morning he was in critical condition, running a fever of 106 degrees as infection spread through his body from the internal damage caused by the bullet. A Newark police stenographer was brought in to sit at his bedside in hopes that Schultz might name his killers before he died. Between roughly 4 and 6 in the afternoon on October 24th, a detective questioned Schultz as he drifted in and out of consciousness under the effects of fever and morphine. What came out was a strange, disjointed stream of statements that offered no useful information about the shooting. He rambled about money, mumbled fragments about people named in his delirium, made references that made no clear sense, and repeatedly called out for his mother. He died later that night, at age 34. The strange transcript of his final hours became famous in its own right. It was reprinted in newspapers within days, and decades later, in 1969, writer William S. Burroughs used it as the basis for an experimental book written in the form of a film script, drawing loosely on the fragmented, surreal quality of Schultz's actual recorded words. Separately, the mystery surrounding the killing gave rise to a lasting legend that Schultz had hidden as much as $7 million in cash, bonds, and jewels somewhere before his death, fearing it would otherwise be seized by tax investigators. His longtime bodyguard, who may have known the location, died in the same attack that killed Schultz, and no trace of any hidden fortune has ever been confirmed or recovered, despite treasure hunters continuing to search areas in upstate New York believed to be connected to Schultz's final days. For years, the killing remained officially unsolved, much like many other syndicate-related murders from the period. That changed in 1940, when the Brooklyn District Attorney's investigation into Murder, Inc. began unraveling the organization from the inside, with cooperating witnesses Abe Rellis and Albert Tannenbaum providing detailed information about killings across the country, including the Schultz hit. Based largely on their testimony, Charles Workman was indicted in New Jersey in March 1940 and extradited to face trial in 1941. During the trial, prosecutors presented testimony that Workman had confided details about the killing to a woman connected to the Buchalter organization, including how he had been left behind at the scene. Partway through presenting his defense, after a key alibi witness recanted testimony that had placed Workman elsewhere at the time of the murder, Workman changed his plea to no contest and was sentenced to life in prison. He served 23 years before being paroled in 1964 and lived quietly until his death in 1979. Mindy Weiss, the other gunman involved in the Schultz hit, was never separately charged for that specific killing, though he was executed in 1944 alongside Louis Buchalter for an unrelated murder. The identity of the getaway driver that night, known only by the nickname Piggy, was never confirmed. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Schultz spent his final years trying to buy his way out of a prosecution he could not shoot his way past. And in the end, it was his own syndicate, the same organization that had once approved his rise, that decided he had become more dangerous alive than dead. Around the same years that New York Syndicate was tearing itself apart from the inside through informants and secret commission votes, a separate and equally violent Jewish gang was running its own criminal empire 800 miles away in Detroit, smuggling whiskey across a river border with a level of internal brutality that would eventually consume the gang from within. Section 7. The Purple Gang, Detroit's Jewish Bootlegging Syndicate. Detroit's Lower East Side in the early 20th century was known by the people who lived there as Little Jerusalem, a crowded stretch of tenements bordered by Gratiot Avenue, Brush Street, Willis Avenue, and Russell Street. Thousands of Jewish immigrants from Russia and Poland had settled there between 1881 and 1914, most working long hours in factories for little pay. As with similar immigrant neighborhoods in New York and Chicago during the same period, poverty pushed some of the younger residents toward crime. A group of boys from this neighborhood, many of them classified as problem children at the local bishop's school, began running together as teenagers under the informal guidance of two established Detroit criminals, Charles Leiter and Henry Shore, who operated an illegal supply business known as the Oakland Sugar House. The boys were first known simply as the Sugar House Boys, or Sugar House Gang. Leading this group were four brothers, Abe, Joe, Raymond, and Isidore Bernstein, whose family had moved to Detroit from New York City. As the group grew older and more organized, it took on a new name that would define Detroit's criminal underworld for the next decade: the Purple Gang. Different accounts describe slightly different origins for the name, though most agree it was meant to suggest something rotten or corrupted, comparable to the color of spoiled meat. When Prohibition began in 1920, the Purple Gang found itself sitting on an enormous natural advantage. Detroit sits directly across a narrow stretch of water from Windsor, Ontario, in Canada, where alcohol remained legal throughout the American Prohibition era. The Detroit River became one of the busiest smuggling corridors in the entire country, and the Purple Gang positioned itself to control much of the traffic moving across it. Rather than simply smuggling their own liquor at first, the gang specialized early on in hijacking shipments that other bootleggers had already smuggled across the river, taking the risk and effort out of other people's hands and keeping the profit for themselves. Over time, they built out a fuller operation of their own, working alongside an affiliated smuggling crew known as the Little Jewish Navy, which handled much of the actual river crossing operations. The gang's reach extended well beyond bootlegging. By the late 1920s, the Purple Gang controlled much of Detroit's illegal gambling, ran a local wire service that fed horse racing results to betting parlors across the city, moved into narcotics distribution, and profited from extortion rackets targeting local businesses. One of their most significant non-bootlegging operations became known as the Cleaners and Dyers War, a violent campaign throughout the mid to late 1920s in which the gang forced Detroit's laundry and dry cleaning businesses into a union structure they controlled, using bombings and physical violence against any company that refused to join. In 1928, 13 members of the gang were brought to trial on extortion charges connected to this scheme, but all 13 were acquitted. The gang also built a business relationship with Chicago's Al Capone. Rather than risk an expensive and unpredictable war for control of Detroit's lucrative bootlegging territory, Capone chose instead to purchase Canadian whiskey directly from the Purple Gang, a decision that avoided direct conflict between the two organizations, while still giving Capone reliable access to high-quality liquor. This relationship also connected the Purple Gang to one of the most infamous unsolved crimes in American history. On February 13, 1929, the day before what would become known as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, Detroit gang leader Abe Bernstein reportedly placed a call to Chicago rival gang leader Bugs Moran, telling him that a shipment of hijacked liquor was on its way and would be delivered the next morning. The following day, 5 men dressed as police officers entered a garage on North Clark Street in Chicago and shot 7 men connected to Moran's operation with machine guns. Chicago investigators long suspected that Purple Gang members had been involved, possibly as spotters helping set up the ambush, though the connection was never definitively proven and no Purple Gang member was ever charged in the case. The gang also carried out its own share of documented violence within Detroit itself. In March 1927, gunmen linked to the Purple Gang killed 3 rival bootleggers at the Mila Flores apartments, an attack notable at the time for being the first killing in Detroit's underworld history carried out using a machine gun. Historical estimates of the gang's total body count over the course of its existence run as high as 500 killings, though historians who have studied the gang's records caution that this figure is likely exaggerated and impossible to fully verify, given how many Prohibition-era gangland killings across the country went unsolved and unattributed. By 1929, the Purple Gang had grown significant enough to earn a seat at the table during the Atlantic City Conference, the meeting organized that May by Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, Johnny Torrio, and Frank Costello, to bring major bootlegging and gambling organizations from across the country into a more coordinated national structure. Abe Bernstein's presence at that meeting placed the Detroit Gang alongside the most powerful criminal organizations in the country at the time, a level of recognition few other regional gangs achieved. Bernstein also personally built a lasting friendship and business relationship with Meyer Lansky, later becoming a partner with Lansky and fellow syndicate figure Joe Adonis in several gambling operations in Florida. The beginning of the end for the Purple Gang traces back to a smaller criminal faction that had drifted into its orbit. In 1927, 3 Chicago gunmen, Joseph Leibowitz, Herman Jaime Paul, and Isidore Sutker, had been extorting protection money from speakeasy operators in Chicago without realizing those operators were already under Al Capone's protection. Once Capone discovered the mistake, he gave the 3 men a blunt choice: leave Chicago voluntarily or leave in a coffin. They chose to leave, relocating to Detroit, where they eventually attached themselves to the Little Jewish Navy faction connected to the Purple Gang. By the fall of 1931, the 3 men had accumulated a debt to the Purple Gang for whiskey they had purchased but not yet paid for, and had begun operating independently outside the territory the Purple Gang leadership had assigned to them, an act treated within organized crime circles at the time as a serious breach of underworld discipline. Detroit was preparing that autumn for a major national convention of the American Legion, an event expected to bring a surge in demand for illegal liquor across the city, and tensions among Detroit's bootleggers were already running high over unpaid debts and repeated hijackings of each other's shipments. Purple Gang leader Ray Bernstein arranged what was presented to the 3 men as a peace conference to resolve the debt and reestablish a working relationship ahead of the Legion convention. Bernstein used a mutual friend of both groups, a man named Saul Levine, to arrange the meeting and put the 3 men at ease, since Levine was trusted by everyone involved. On September 16, 1931, Levine escorted Leibowitz, Paul, and Sutker to an apartment at 1740 Collingwood Avenue that Purple Gang members had rented specifically for the meeting. The 3 men believed they were walking into a friendly negotiation over the money they owed and the chance to keep working with the gang through the upcoming Legion convention rush. Instead, once inside the apartment, Purple Gang gunmen shot and killed all 3 men. Levine, who had unknowingly helped set up the meeting, was allowed to leave unharmed, largely because of his personal friendship with Bernstein, though Bernstein reportedly planned to have him killed later and have the murders pinned on him. The getaway car sped away from the building so quickly that it nearly struck a small child playing nearby, and the sister of a local judge, according to a building caretaker who witnessed the escape. Fearing that the Purple Gang intended to kill him next and frame him for the triple murder, Levine chose to cooperate with investigators and testified against the men involved. Police tracked down the suspects within days. Ray Bernstein and Harry Keywell were arrested in their pajamas after an anonymous tip led detectives to a location connected to another gang associate. Irving Milberg was arrested the following night while preparing to leave town. A fourth man believed to be involved, Harry Fleischer, evaded capture for months, eventually surrendering to prosecutors nearly a year later, though the case against him ultimately fell apart after Levine could no longer be located to testify a second time. The trial that followed placed heavy security around Levine throughout the proceedings, with as many as 10 armed guards protecting him during his testimony, since he understood exactly what happened to people who testified against the Purple Gang. Bernstein, Milberg, and Keywell were all convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Detroit's chief of detectives at the time, James McCarty, told reporters the convictions broke the back of what had been more than 5 years of arrogance and terror from the gang. The Collingwood Manor Massacre, as it became known, is widely regarded by historians as the single event that ended the Purple Gang's dominance over Detroit's underworld. The gang did not simply fade quietly after the convictions. Its remaining members, no longer held together by strong central leadership, began turning on each other and falling to other rivals over the following years. In July 1929, Associate Irving Shapiro had already been killed in what investigators described as a gangland-style abduction and murder. In November 1933, the bodies of 2 more Purple Gang figures, Abe Axler and Eddie Fletcher, men so inseparable that other gangsters nicknamed them the Siamese Twins, were found shot to death inside a car in Detroit. Other members were killed or imprisoned in the years that followed, as Detroit's Italian-American organized crime factions gradually absorbed much of the territory and business the Purple Gang had once controlled outright. Abe Bernstein, the gang's most senior surviving leader, avoided the violent fate of many of his former associates. Rather than fight to hold on to a criminal empire that was already crumbling, Bernstein negotiated what has been described by historians as one of the only peaceful transfers of power recorded in American organized crime history, stepping back and ceding Detroit's remaining rackets to the city's Italian Mafia in exchange for a lifetime pension. He spent his later years connected to legitimate and semi-legitimate gambling ventures in Florida, alongside old friends Meyer Lansky and Joe Adonis. And he died peacefully in 1968 at a hotel in downtown Detroit. A strikingly quiet ending compared to almost every other major figure connected to his gang's rise and fall. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Purple Gang's violent collapse from within echoed a pattern that showed up again and again across Jewish organized crime during this era. Men built up by loyalty and shared background, eventually turning on each other once money, territory, or fear of prosecution entered the picture. Decades before any of the Bernstein brothers set foot in that Collingwood Avenue apartment, an earlier generation had already learned that lesson in New York, where the man widely credited with turning street crime into organized business was gunned down over a card game debt and died refusing to name the person who shot him. Section 8. Arnold Rothstein, the brain who invented organized crime. Arnold Rothstein was born in New York City on January 17, 1882, into a middle-class Jewish family. His father had built a respectable garment business and was well regarded in the community as an upstanding, hard-working man. Rothstein attended school until age 16, then went to work as a traveling salesman, a job that took him around the region and introduced him to something that would define the rest of his life: gambling. He had a natural talent for numbers and quickly built a reputation as a skilled card and dice player, turning modest winnings from craps and poker games into what became, by his early 20s, a genuine fortune. By age 27, Rothstein had opened his own gambling house in Manhattan, and he expanded from there into additional establishments. He also built connections to horse racing, eventually gaining significant influence over Saratoga Springs, New York, then the center of American thoroughbred racing. where he was widely believed to manipulate betting lines and race outcomes to his own advantage. He operated for years under the protection of Tammany Hall, the political machine that controlled much of New York City's government, using bribes and favors to keep police and prosecutors from interfering with his operations. By 1912, at age 30, Rothstein was already a millionaire, an extraordinary achievement for a gambler operating largely outside the law. What separated Rothstein from other gamblers and racketeers of his era was not just his wealth, but his approach to crime itself. Where earlier generations of New York gangsters had operated through street violence and chaotic turf battles, Rothstein treated criminal enterprise the way a legitimate businessman might treat any other industry, with careful planning, calculated risk, and a network of paid officials to smooth over problems before they became public. Historians studying organized crime in America have since credited him with helping transform criminal activity from disorganized thuggery into something closer to a structured business, a shift that would define the following decades of American organized crime. Rothstein's name became permanently tied to one of the most notorious scandals in American sports history in 1919, when 8 players on the Chicago White Sox conspired to intentionally lose the World Series to the Cincinnati Reds in exchange for money from gamblers. The scandal became known as the Black Sox Scandal, since the White Sox carried that nickname afterward. According to testimony given during the Cook County grand jury investigation into the fix, 2 men connected to the scheme, William Maharg and former player Bill Burns, approached Rothstein directly with the proposal, and Rothstein initially declined, saying he did not believe such an arrangement could realistically be pulled off. Despite this, evidence presented at the time suggested Rothstein later became involved through intermediaries, and it was widely believed within both gambling and law enforcement circles that Rothstein bet heavily against the White Sox and profited substantially once the fix played out. Rothstein was eventually summoned to testify before the grand jury investigating the scandal, where he denied any involvement and framed himself as an innocent businessman being unfairly dragged into the affair by lower-level gamblers who had used his name without his permission. Prosecutors were unable to find enough evidence to bring charges against him, and he was never indicted in connection with the fix. 8 White Sox players were ultimately banned from professional baseball for life as a result of the scandal, while Rothstein walked away from the entire affair without a single criminal charge. The scandal made Rothstein's name synonymous with corruption in professional sports, and it followed him for the rest of his life and beyond. Author F. Scott Fitzgerald based a character in his 1925 novel, The Great Gatsby, a gambler named Meyer Wolfsheim, directly on Rothstein, with the character explicitly described in the book as the man who had fixed the World Series. When Prohibition began in 1920, Rothstein recognized an opportunity larger than anything he had built through gambling alone. He moved quickly into bootlegging, using his financial resources and network of connections to fund and organize liquor smuggling operations at a scale most other criminals of the era could not match. In doing so, he became a mentor and financial backer to a younger generation of criminals who would go on to define organized crime in America for decades afterward, including Charlie Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, and Bugsy Siegel, among many others. Lansky himself later spoke admiringly of Rothstein's intelligence, remarking that Rothstein had an extraordinary business mind, and suggesting that had he pursued a legitimate career in finance instead of crime, he likely would have become just as wealthy through entirely legal means. Rothstein reportedly moved beyond alcohol as well in his later years, becoming involved in narcotics trafficking, including cocaine and opium, expanding into what were, even by underworld standards, unusually risky and lucrative criminal ventures. By 1928, Rothstein's decades-long winning streak at the gambling tables had begun to unravel. That October, he took part in a high-stakes poker game in Manhattan that stretched across multiple days, organized by fellow gambler George McManus, known to associates as Hump. According to accounts later pieced together by journalists and investigators, the game had been rigged against Rothstein by 2 other gamblers present, Titanic Thompson, and Nate Raymond, through a series of complicated side bets that left Rothstein owing a combined total of roughly $320,000 once the game concluded. An enormous sum at the time, worth well over $6 million in modern terms. Aware, or at least suspicious, that he had been cheated, Rothstein refused to pay the debt, insisting the game had been fixed against him. A claim carrying a certain irony given his own reputation for fixing the outcomes of other people's games throughout his career. Separately, McManus himself owed Rothstein a much smaller sum, roughly $51,000. And Rothstein reportedly told associates he expected to be able to settle his own larger debts once the November 1928 elections concluded, having placed substantial bets backing Herbert Hoover for president and Franklin Roosevelt for New York governor, both of whom he expected to win. On the evening of November 4th, 1928, Rothstein received a phone call and went to a business meeting at the Park Central Hotel in Manhattan at 7th Avenue near 55th Street. Sometime during that meeting, he was shot in the abdomen with a .38 caliber revolver. He was found by hotel staff near a service entrance, bleeding heavily, and police traced a blood trail back to the room where the meeting had taken place. He was taken to a hospital in Manhattan, where he died 2 days later, on November 6, 1928, at age 46. Even as he lay dying, Rothstein refused to cooperate with police attempting to learn who had shot him. When investigators asked him directly who was responsible, he responded only that they should stick to their own trade, according to contemporary newspaper accounts. A blunt refusal that kept faith with the underworld's long-standing code against cooperating with law enforcement, regardless of the personal cost. George McManus, the organizer of the poker game, was arrested and charged with the killing, but he was later acquitted in court due to insufficient evidence connecting him directly to the shooting. Gambler Titanic Thompson, one of the men believed to have helped rig the original card game, testified at McManus's trial that McManus was, in his words, a good loser who would never have resorted to shooting Rothstein over a gambling debt. According to author Kevin Cook, who researched the case decades later, Thompson privately told acquaintances that the actual shooter had not been McManus at all, but rather a bagman connected to the gambling ring named Hyman Biller, who fled to Cuba shortly after the killing and was never brought to trial. A separate theory of the murder emerged decades later in a 1971 biography of Dutch Schultz, in which crime reporter Paul Sand suggested that Schultz himself may have ordered Rothstein's killing, in retaliation for the earlier murder of Schultz's close friend and business partner, Joey Noe, a killing that had been carried out by a Rothstein protege named Jack Legs Diamond. This theory has never been proven, and like the McManus and Biller theories, it remains speculation rather than an established fact. The murder of Arnold Rothstein remains to this day officially unsolved. Rothstein's death sent ripples through both the New York underworld and city politics. Several of his criminal enterprises and connections were absorbed by the younger men he had mentored, including Frank Erickson, Meyer Lansky, and Bugsy Siegel, all of whom had learned much of their approach to organized crime directly from watching Rothstein operate. His death also became connected, at least in the eyes of many historians, to a broader unraveling of the corrupt Tammany Hall political machine that had protected him and so many other criminal figures for years, a decline that eventually helped pave the way for reform-minded Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia to rise to power in New York City politics in the 1930s. A decade after his death, Rothstein's only surviving brother formally declared his estate bankrupt, a quiet and almost unremarkable final chapter for a man once known across the city simply as the Big Bankroll. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Rothstein never lived to see the full structure that his approach to crime eventually produced. The coordinated national syndicate his own protégés would go on to build within a single year of his death, bringing together Italian, Jewish, and Irish organizations under one loosely shared business framework for the very first time, in a hotel conference room in Atlantic City, New Jersey. Section 9. The Commission and the Kosher Nostra. Inside the National Crime Syndicate. The structure that eventually governed American organized crime for most of the 20th century did not exist before 1931. Before that year, the New York Italian Mafia operated under a single, all-powerful boss, known as the Capo di tutti capi, or boss of all bosses. A position that concentrated enormous authority in one man and, predictably, made that position something every ambitious rival wanted to seize by force. The violent struggle for that title, known as the Castellamarese War, pitted Joe Masseria against Salvatore Maranzano through 1930 and into early 1931. Charlie Lucky Luciano, then a rising lieutenant under Masseria, arranged for his own boss to be killed that April, then turned around and helped orchestrate Maranzano's murder just months later in September, eliminating both men who had fought for sole control of New York's underworld. Rather than simply claiming the vacant boss of bosses title for himself and repeating the same cycle of violence, Luciano proposed something different. A governing council made up of multiple bosses who would share power and vote on major decisions together rather than answering to any single supreme leader. This body became known simply as the Commission. Its founding members included the bosses of what became known as New York's Five Families, along with a seat reserved for the Chicago outfit, whose influence over Midwestern rackets, particularly labor unions and gambling, was significant enough to warrant a voice at the national level. Other powerful regional organizations, including families based in Buffalo, Philadelphia, and Detroit, participated in major commission gatherings over the years without holding permanent voting seats of their own. The commission's actual power was more limited than popular films and books have often suggested. It had no formal charter, no dedicated staff, and no independent enforcement mechanism separate from the member organizations themselves. It functioned more like a business cartel with a built-in dispute resolution process than anything resembling a government. It set rules meant to prevent the kind of chaos that had defined the Castellamarese War, including a strict prohibition on killing law enforcement officers or public officials, since such killings risked triggering exactly the kind of nationwide crackdown organized crime leadership wanted to avoid. It established standards for who could be formally inducted as a member of an Italian crime family, and it created a process for settling disputes when one boss felt he had been treated unfairly by a rival organization, or even by someone within his own family. When the commission did decide that a specific action, including a killing, needed to happen for the good of the wider structure, its only real method of enforcement was convincing member families to act together, since it held no direct authority to compel obedience on its own. One structural detail set the commission apart from the way it is often remembered in popular culture. It was, by design, an entirely Italian institution. Formal membership in a commission-recognized crime family required full Sicilian or Italian heritage, a rule that excluded every Jewish organized crime figure covered so far, regardless of how much money they controlled or how central their role was to the syndicate's overall operation. Meyer Lansky, despite functioning for decades as one of the most trusted financial minds in the entire underworld, could never become a made member of an Italian family, and could never sit on the commission itself. The same was true for Louis Buchalter, Bugsy Siegel, Mickey Cohen, and every other Jewish figure discussed throughout this history. What Jewish organized crime figures held instead was something less formal, but, in practical terms, nearly as powerful. A standing partnership built on decades of personal trust, shared business interests, and a level of financial expertise that Italian bosses depended on but could not fully replicate on their own. This dual structure, an Italian commission governing formal mafia membership alongside an unofficial but essential Jewish financial and criminal network working in close partnership with it, is what journalists and later historians began referring to as the National Crime Syndicate as a whole, a term broader than the commission itself. Within Jewish communities and Israeli newspapers in later decades, this Jewish side of organized crime picked up its own nickname, playing off the Italian term Cosa Nostra, meaning our thing. Jewish organized crime became known informally as the Kosher Nostra, a label that stuck in press coverage for decades afterward, even though the men it described never operated as a single unified organization, the way the label implies. For years, this entire structure operated with remarkably little public exposure. Local police departments in most cities lacked the resources, coordination, and often the basic willingness to investigate organized crime as a connected national phenomenon, rather than a series of isolated local problems. Bribery of police and court officials was common enough in many cities to make serious investigation difficult, even when individual officers wanted to pursue it. That changed substantially in 1950 and 1951, when a United States Senate committee chaired by Tennessee Senator Estes Kefauver held a series of hearings specifically investigating organized crime's reach across state lines. The hearings were broadcast on live television, an unusual choice for the era, and they drew an enormous national audience, eager to watch real gangsters answer, or more often refuse to answer, questions from senators on live camera. The Kefauver Committee concluded that a coordinated criminal organization it identified as the Mafia was operating throughout the country, a formal government acknowledgement that had never been made so publicly before. Many organized crime figures were subpoenaed to testify, but most gave evasive or meaningless answers, and few provided any real information. Despite this lack of direct cooperation, the hearings permanently changed public awareness of organized crime in America, and Meyer Lansky's name came up repeatedly throughout the proceedings as one of the syndicate's central financial figures. Even after the Kefauver hearings, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, under longtime director J. Edgar Hoover, continued for years to publicly deny that any nationally coordinated criminal organization existed at all. Hoover's skepticism, or perhaps his reluctance to commit FBI resources to an investigation he doubted could produce clean, provable results, meant that federal law enforcement largely sat out sustained organized crime investigation through most of the 1950s. That position became impossible to maintain after November 14, 1957, when New York State Police stumbled onto one of the largest documented gatherings of organized crime leadership in American history. A state trooper named Edgar Croswell had been quietly monitoring a rural property in the small town of Apalachin, New York, owned by a local beverage distributor named Joseph Barbera, after noticing unusual activity there the previous year. When a large number of expensive cars bearing license plates from states across the country began arriving at Barbera's estate that November, Croswell called for backup and set up roadblocks on the roads leading away from the property. The meeting, which had been called by New York boss Vito Genovese shortly after he orchestrated the murder of rival boss Albert Anastasia earlier that same year, was meant to formally confirm Genovese's new position at the top of organized crime's leadership structure, and settle outstanding disputes among various families. Instead, as police closed in, the gathering dissolved into chaos. Some attendees tried to drive away and were stopped directly at the roadblocks. Others fled on foot through the surrounding fields in their expensive suits, with some reportedly losing their shoes in the mud during the escape. Of the roughly 100 men believed to have been present that day, 58 were caught and identified, including senior figures from Mafia families based in New York, Chicago, Detroit, Buffalo, Tampa, and several other cities. Every man arrested that day was, consistent with the Commission's Italian-only membership rules, an Italian-American Mafia figure. No Jewish organized crime leader was present, a detail that quietly confirmed just how separate the formal Commission structure remained from its Jewish financial partners, even a quarter century after the two groups had begun working together. 20 of the men caught at Apalachin were eventually charged with conspiring to obstruct justice by lying to investigators about the purpose of the gathering, and all 20 were convicted in January 1959. Every one of those convictions was later overturned on appeal in 1960 due to insufficient evidence. Despite the lack of lasting criminal convictions, the raid permanently changed how the federal government approached organized crime. Hoover could no longer credibly deny that a coordinated national criminal network existed once 58 of its senior leaders had been caught together at a single rural estate. Within months, the FBI created what it called the Top Hoodlum Program, directing field offices across the country to begin systematically gathering intelligence on organized crime figures in their regions for the first time, a shift in federal policy that eventually laid the groundwork for the much larger prosecutions that would target Mafia leadership decades later. The commission itself continued operating for years afterward, surviving internal power struggles, assassination plots among its own members, and repeated law enforcement pressure, until federal prosecutors finally used a relatively new law known as the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, or RICO, to prosecute the commission itself as a criminal enterprise in a landmark 1985 trial. Several senior mafia bosses were convicted, marking one of the most significant blows to the commission's formal structure in its entire history. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. By the time that final trial took place, the Jewish side of the National Crime Syndicate that had partnered with the Commission since 1929 had already faded from prominence for decades. The men who built it, born as poor immigrant children on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, in Brownsville, in Detroit's Little Jerusalem, and in similar neighborhoods across the country, had by the 1960s and 1970s largely died, retired, or found themselves running out of new options to avoid the prosecutions closing in around them. One of Lansky's closest and most loyal lieutenants found a path out of that pressure that Lansky himself would later try and fail to follow, using a legal right available to any Jewish person anywhere in the world to walk away from an American prison sentence entirely and start over on the other side of the ocean. Section 10. Joseph Doc Stacher, the one who got away. Joseph Stacher was born around 1902 in Letichiv, a town in what is now Ukraine, under the name Gedale Oystacher. His family emigrated to the United States in 1912 when he was around 10 years old, settling in Newark, New Jersey. Like so many other boys who would go on to careers in organized crime, he Americanized his name once he arrived, eventually becoming known as Joseph Stacher, and he picked up the nickname Doc along the way, a name that stuck with him for the rest of his life, despite having no connection to any actual medical training. As a teenager in Newark, Stacher became close friends with Abner Longy Zwilman, a local gang leader who ran a group called the Happy Ramblers, which offered protection to Jewish shopkeepers and street vendors in exchange for regular payments, the same basic business model that dozens of similar gangs across New York and New Jersey were running during that era. Stacher joined Zwilman's operation and quickly rose within it. His path soon crossed with Meyer Lansky, and the two men would remain close partners for the rest of Stacher's criminal career, with Stacher eventually becoming one of Lansky's most trusted and loyal lieutenants. In 1931, at Lansky's request, Stacher organized and helped run a meeting at the Franconia Hotel in New York, bringing together leading Jewish organized crime figures from across the city to formally discuss joining forces with the Italian-American Mafia, rather than continuing to operate as separate, competing organizations. This meeting took place around the same time that Lucky Luciano was consolidating the newly formed commission structure on the Italian side following the end of the Castellamarese War. And together, these parallel efforts helped cement the broader partnership that the press would later label the National Crime Syndicate. Stacher spent the following decades functioning as one of the key liaisons between the Jewish and Italian sides of that partnership, a role that placed him at the center of the syndicate's business dealings, without ever putting his own name in the spotlight the way flashier figures like Bugsy Siegel or Mickey Cohen did. Stacher's business interests during the 1920s included part ownership alongside Lansky of the Arrowhead Inn, an illegal gambling house in Saratoga Springs, New York, a resort town that had already built a reputation for gambling decades earlier, thanks in part to Arnold Rothstein, who had opened a similar establishment there years before. Through the 1930s, Stacher managed West Coast and Caribbean gambling operations on Lansky's behalf, and he reportedly became a silent partner in Columbia Pictures, giving him a quiet financial stake in the legitimate entertainment industry alongside his criminal enterprises. He also partnered with his old friend Zwilman in a company called Runyon Sales, which manufactured and distributed coin-operated machines, a business that provided a legal front generating real revenue while also serving broader syndicate interests. In 1946, Stacker helped organize the Havana Conference, the same gathering in Cuba where Lansky and the recently deported Luciano brought together major organized crime figures from across the country to set policy for the syndicate's operations in the years following the end of the Second World War. In the years afterward, Stacker took on responsibility for overseeing gambling operations in Las Vegas, particularly at the Sands and Fremont casinos, acting as Lansky's representative and, according to several accounts, as a payoff man, responsible for distributing skimmed casino profits to syndicate figures back east. He also reportedly served as the syndicate's paymaster in dealings with Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista, delivering bribes that helped keep Havana open to large-scale, mob-controlled gambling throughout the 1950s. Stotcher's legal troubles began building through the 1950s. In 1952, the Internal Revenue Bureau determined that he owed roughly $340,000 in unpaid taxes, covering income from 1933 through 1941, and he ultimately paid the full amount after the government placed liens against his assets. That same year, a federal grand jury in New York indicted him on charges of illegal gambling and conspiracy connected to his old Arrowhead Inn operation in Saratoga Springs. Stotcher fought extradition from Nevada for roughly a year before eventually returning to New York in 1953, where he pled guilty to 20 separate charges. A more serious threat emerged in 1956, when the federal government successfully revoked Stotcher's United States citizenship, which he had originally obtained in 1930. The government argued that Stotcher had concealed material facts about his criminal history and character when he applied for naturalization, including his membership in Zvillman's gang and prior arrests he had failed to disclose. A district court ordered his citizenship revoked, and the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit upheld that decision in 1958, making Stotcher's case one of the earliest instances of the federal government using denaturalization provisions specifically to strip citizenship from a high-profile organized crime figure. Despite winning this legal victory, the Justice Department did not immediately move to deport him. Federal agents did not act until 1961, when they detained Stacker upon his return from a vacation abroad and held him for what was called deferred inspection, eventually releasing him on parole while deportation proceedings moved forward. Deportation itself presented an unusual legal problem. Stacker's country of origin, now part of Soviet-controlled Ukraine, was governed by a communist regime, and federal law at the time prohibited deporting anyone to a communist-controlled country, leaving the government temporarily stuck with a man it had already stripped of citizenship, but had no legal way to actually remove. The final blow came in 1964, when federal prosecutors caught up with Stacker on a separate charge, tax evasion, connected to gambling income he had concealed throughout the 1940s and 1950s. Stacker pled guilty to 2 counts and was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison. Facing that sentence, and with deportation to his country of origin legally blocked, Stacker negotiated an alternative arrangement with authorities. Rather than serve his prison term, he would pay a fine and voluntarily leave the United States entirely. In 1965, Stacker exercised a right available to him as a Jewish person anywhere in the world, invoking Israel's law of return, a statute passed in 1950 granting any Jew the ability to immigrate to Israel and receive citizenship there. Stacker worried that Israeli authorities might refuse his application, the way they would later refuse Lansky's application just a few years afterward, since Israeli law allowed the government discretion to deny citizenship to applicants with a serious criminal background who might be considered a threat to public welfare. To improve his chances, Stacker reportedly asked his longtime friend, entertainer Frank Sinatra, to use his own connections to reach an Orthodox member of the Israeli parliament, known as the Knesset, who Sinatra believed owed him a personal favor. As part of this effort to build goodwill, Stacker donated $100,000 toward what he believed was an Orthodox Jewish charitable cause. Instead of using the money the way Stacker understood it would be used, the rabbi and Knesset member reportedly diverted the funds toward building a kosher hotel in Jerusalem. Once Stacker discovered what had happened to his donation, he filed a lawsuit, a case that drew significant press attention and no small amount of public amusement in Israel, at the idea of an American organized crime figure being outmaneuvered by a rabbi. Stacher ultimately won the case and recovered his money. Unlike Lansky, whose own attempt to settle permanently in Israel collapsed after a lengthy legal battle that ended with Israel's Supreme Court ruling against him in 1972, Stacher succeeded in making Israel his permanent home. Israeli newspapers at the time referred to him regularly as one of the leading figures of what the press had begun calling the Kosher Nostra, playing off the Italian term Cosa Nostra to describe the loosely connected network of Jewish organized crime figures who had operated alongside, but never formally inside, the Italian Mafia's commission structure for decades. Stacher's successful immigration reportedly encouraged other Jewish organized crime figures to attempt the same path in the years that followed, seeing Israel as a potential safe haven from American prosecution in a way that had not been widely tested before his case. Stacher spent his final years living quietly in Israel, largely out of the criminal spotlight that had followed him for most of his adult life. In the late 1970s, a group of Israeli journalists working on a biography of Meyer Lansky turned to Stacher as one of their primary sources, and he reportedly provided extensive information about decades of organized crime history in America. Unlike informants who cooperated with prosecutors to save themselves from prison time, Stacher's motivation for speaking with the journalists was described by the authors as personal pride in his old friend Lansky, wanting the full and accurate story of Lansky's life told, rather than simply informing on him for personal gain. Joseph Stacher died on February 28, 1977, of an apparent heart attack in a hotel room in Munich, West Germany, at roughly age 75. His body was transported back to Israel for burial. The funeral was small and deliberately quiet by comparison to the kind of elaborate gangland send-off he likely would have received had he died in the United States decades earlier. Only 8 people, all men, attended the service. And the nameplate on his grave was reportedly altered afterward to help conceal the exact location of his burial site. Back in the United States, Meyer Lansky, who had spent his own final years barred from ever returning to the country his old friend had successfully made home, sent an enormous arrangement of red roses to the funeral, with a simple inscription on the ribbon reading only, "To Doc, from Meyer." Stacher's path out of American prosecution turned out to be the exception rather than the rule among the men who built Jewish organized crime in the United States. Most of the others covered throughout this history met far more violent or far more public ends, whether in a Beverly Hills living room, a Newark restaurant bathroom, a hotel window in Coney Island, or an electric chair at Sing Sing. By the time Stacher died quietly in Munich, the generation of immigrant boys who had built an entire criminal empire out of Lower East Side poverty had almost entirely passed from the scene, though the pattern they established of Jewish criminal networks rising, partnering with other ethnic organizations, and eventually fading as assimilation reduced the economic desperation that had produced them in the first place, would go on to repeat itself decades later among an entirely new wave of immigrants, this time from the collapsing Soviet Union, in neighborhoods like Brighton Beach in Brooklyn. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.